Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're talking about why the rally and garrison meta shifts so much faster than the field meta. Really, this comes down to two main points. First is efficiency. A 5% difference in quality of trade in a field troop may be 100 or 1,000 troops wounded, maybe even a couple thousand. But when it comes to garrisons and rallies, that's tens of thousands of dead troops. And that's not troops that you can heal back. So that's something that is significant. That extra couple percent is huge, whereas an inefficient pairing in the field is suboptimal but usable. The second is depth. You can have a second or third field march of a specific troop type, but that's not really something you could do with a rally or with a garrison. And with garrisons, you do have a little bit more flexibility, but overall, having that top efficient pair, you can't have a second or third pair because it's just not efficient and it's not something that is viable in terms of rally or garrison. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're talking about the Expedition Shop. And whether you've completed 80 levels or not, here are some things you should be doing every day. First, make sure you collect this chest. You get free rewards that are super practical, whether you're talking about EXP tomes or coins, and it helps you use this shop more efficiently. First, make sure you're always exchanging these. You can exchange it for Alliance credits later on, which is super useful, and you never know when you're going to need those. Second, make sure you're exchanging all the coins down here for anything that's not a commander sculpture and using your free refresh. I don't recommend you using the gem refreshes, but just make sure you're at least buying the things you can for free, because these coins stack up very quickly. If you do have a bunch of extra coins, a couple things you could consider doing is buying these sculptures and exchanging them in the KvK fort rebuild process to get other items, or just continually buying more stuff and then exchanging them for credits. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're going over the VIP shop. This is really an incredible value and something I recommend you always look into every week. And here are the things you should be looking to buy every week. Of course, you should always be buying these basic exploit recovery and speed ups, as well as the equipment materials. Those are all bought with resources, which are basically free because you're going to be farming all the time anyway. So make sure you're buying those because they're well worthwhile. Next, if you can get these star sculptures, they're definitely good to build up if you don't have a lot of them, because as you start to expertise legendary commanders, those tend to be very pricey, and they could take up to 1,000 or more to get from 5 stars to 6 stars. So even if you think you have enough, you might not. Last but certainly not least, if you're looking for value, speed ups are probably the best value in this shop, and everything else tends to fall off after that. But the higher tier of speed up, the more overall discount and value you get versus the stock price. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're covering what the best generalist civilizations are for each troop type. First, for archers, we have the Ottoman. With skill damage being so heavy, this is pretty much the easiest way to get great value, no matter if you're garrison, rally, or field. And archer health is terrific, so going with the Ottomans is a safe bet, unless you're really heavy on normal damage, after which I recommend you going for an infantry civ or for the Maya. Next, for infantry, France is just great. Troop health is good, and it's all troops, not just infantry. Hospital healing speed is terrific for field, and it's useful for garrisons as well. And generally, it's just great. And then last, but certainly not least, for KvKs, I recommend Germany. While you don't have anything super flashy, trading speed is great for all units, which is great for generalists, and action point recovery is pretty good too, so it's a great option. Alternatively, you could also go with the Byzantines here. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're talking about what each cavalry civilization is used for in Rise of Kingdoms. First, for Germany, a great special unit, good training speed, a good action point recovery, makes this a great field account or garrison account that has a lot of good unit stats if you want to overall use it, or one that tends to farm barbarians very often. You can get a lot of value out of this. Next, Spain tends to be one that people pretty much use until they realize it's not a very good civilization because it's fairly bad. Next, Byzantium is a great civilization with the cavalry health. The hospital capacity is great for field heavy players, and the unit is pretty good too, so it tends to be skewed towards a more field heavy playstyle. Last but certainly not least, Arabia is the rally civilization. If you're a rally leader as cavalry, this has got to be the civilization you need, because the rally to army damage is just completely solid. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're talking about archer civilizations, and Let's get right into it with the Maya. The newest civilization has decent damage with the defense, and the normal damage of all types being boosted is excellent. So it is something that is pretty good for normal damage heavy, but archers don't really have that. So I'm really eager to see what's next to really make use of this. Next, of course, Britain is pretty much a transitional civ. It's used sometimes for the training speed, but you're just better off using Germany. Even as an archer player, it's just not very useful. Next, China is great for overall build-ups, so it's great for that civilization. While Egypt also has a little bit of that, as well as rallied army damage, which is excellent. Korea tends to be the other side of that with research speed instead of building speed. And last but certainly not least, the Ottomans have great health, good skill damage, and it tends to be the flagship overall civilization because skill damage is pretty ubiquitous right now. Welcome to another episode of the Boris Tip of the Week. In this episode, we're going over what each infantry civilization excels at. First, of course, Greece is the premier rally civ. Rally army damage is excellent, and infantry health is terrific, so it tends to be overwhelmingly what most people use for rallies. Next, Rome is a fairly popular field civilization. The march speed is useful, but it's not nearly as popular as some of the other options, but it's somewhat solid as a middle ground option. Next, we have the Vikings, which are really great for swarm resistance and people who don't like to be swarmed. They tend to be pretty good with normal damage commanders because of it, but it's also just a general anti-swarm civilization. Japan tends to be a farm civ, so overall it's not used very much in the field because it's just not very good. And France is the premier field and do-it-all civilization because the health is good and the healing speed is excellent. It tends to be the most popular choice. Here's why Season of Conquest gear is so powerful. So Season of Conquest items tend to be the helm and the weapon, and they tend to be some of the more powerful non-set piece items. And there's two reasons for this. One, generally speaking, the stats line up with the main set stats. So if you had defense on the helm, like you do with Cav, you have defense on the Season of Conquest item. So you don't really have a conflict of stat. Second, you tend to get more. While you get 11% defense on the set piece, you get 15% on the Season of Conquest. So keep that in mind as well, especially since when you go to expertise it, you gain 30% of that value, so it ends up being an extra percent or so. So it can be pretty significant. Third, it tends to be the more valuable items. Weapons tend to be a huge stat block, and helms are no slouch either, so having bonus on top of the base stat can be a huge difference. Here's how to compare all unit stats versus unit specific stats. When it comes to especially garrisons, stats can be very confusing because if you have cavalry stat but infantry units in your defense, you don't really get as much value from that. So today's video I'm quickly covering how to actually deduce what stats you're getting. First, of course, is read the text carefully. If it says it contains only a specific unit type, the second you have any other unit type, you lose that bonus. So take that away from your consideration in terms of what stats you get. Next, when you have a unit stat that is specific like cavalry or infantry or archers, take the percentage of the troops in your intended defense and multiply it by that value. So if you have 70% infantry and you get 20% defense, you get 14% true stat gained. Use these two in conjunction and you're able to quickly compare stats between leadership and normal command. This is a staggered formation review. Staggered formation is the newest formation in Rise of Kingdoms, which at a base level gives 15% march speed when marching to a rally or a garrison. This is a unique formation, which is essentially to be used in supporting rallies and garrisons quickly. The specialty inscriptions give move speed while routed, damage reduction when hit with an AoE once every 60 seconds, unit capacity, and less severely wounded troops from this unit in a rally or garrison. Overall, this is just not a very great formation. It does have some potential for filler counts, but it's ultimately not one you'll want to have for any sort of practical use in the field or outside of just being a filler. And the only defensive armament has a massive cooldown. The one unique idea is that 30% AoE reduction will reduce the damage you take while trying to reinforce a building from nearby or reinforce a rally from garrison's AoEs. But outside of that, there's no real heavy combat viability here. Here's why Tercio might not be as great as it looks like on paper. So when Tercio came out, there's a lot of excitement, and there's a video coming here very shortly, but I wanted to dispel some of the misconceptions. First, It's only specific to when you garrison the city, so it doesn't apply to a garrison defense. That already makes it incredibly niche because city defense is a very, very small subset. Next, attack, defense, and health will get converted to all units, but it's only on the armament specific stats, not on equipment or anything else. Last, but certainly not least, you're looking at an armament that really converts stats that are not all damage because all damage already hits all units. So oftentimes you're converting for 8 to 10% defense, attack, and health, when you really should be having all damage and you're only getting a defense and attack. Ultimately, it'll depend on the specialty inscriptions, which we're going over in an upcoming video, but it doesn't look super promising versus wedge or arch or hollow square. One of the most frequent questions I get when talking to people about strategy and leadership is what seeding means. So seeding, in simplest terms, is a value assigned to your kingdom. It could be Imperium, A, B, C, or D. And as you go down the list, the overall power declines. So a D seed on average has fewer active power than an A seed. And that's something that's important to consider because there's two factors there in a seed's ability to fight. If you have 100% of your seed that is contributing to fighting, you have more contribution power, even at a lower seed. Whereas you may have an A kingdom that has a lot of players who just do not contribute. And that means you may be an A seed, but only able to fight at a C or D seed. So keep that in mind, especially when it comes to active players and contribution, because that does impact your seed. But overall, that's the basics. A big thing that leadership members tend to wrap their head around and really struggle with is off-season strategy. When do you build power and when do you not? And here's my general strategy that I like to employ for myself and really suggest for others. For me, once the off-season starts, I don't tend to train up a lot of T5 because that's heavier on your matchmaking rating and heavier on your speed ups overall if you're trying to get rounded up. So I tend to stay in T4 or lower territory. T3 is a popular option as well because you can then train them up to T5 pretty quickly and it makes it easier for the Bastion training events because the points are more even. But then, once we get close to KvK, I will use an expansion on my T5 troops and set it up so that it's ready to collect during pre-KvK. This means that when I collect them, it's after the rating, and it helps you get those T5 troops without impacting your kingdom's rating long term. This is something that's near and dear to me as a leadership member, and something that kind of is interesting because there's different arguments for both. But in today's video, I wanted to cover, especially for kingdoms that are small enough to have a choice, having a one alliance kingdom versus a multiple alliance kingdom. First, for one alliance kingdoms, you have a lot more cohesion because you have everybody working with each other on a daily basis. This also means that because of everybody's in the same kingdom, a lot of the other shells don't get developed and the other alliances don't get developed in terms of tech, resources, etc. Alternatively, multiple alliance kingdoms tend to have more flexibility come KvK because they have more shells, they have more credits and more built up resources, but you may not have as much cohesion. A great alternative I recommend if you want to go the multiple alliance route is to just schedule group events where you do build that cohesion or just have people moving back and forth. Here's some tips to set your Shadow Legion defense for maximum results. First, mixed defenses are key. If you do have mixed garrisons, using Hera, Lapu, or YSS are top-notch options because they benefit all your troops. You can still set your primary lead to be whatever your main troop type is, but you want one of those mixed defenses on your wall if you can manage it. Second, if you do not have any garrison commanders, focus on commanders who have good damage reduction and skills that aren't specifically mentioned as being field or leading a rally. If you don't have any of those, Sun Tzu is a great option too. Even though he is not a Season of Conquest commander, the added bonus that the stats aren't specific to any one troop type. Last, but certainly not least, optimize for damage. The more damage you can deal, the less chance you'll have Shadow Legion marches stacking up on your wall, and you could let your garrison reset between fights. It helps if you're online to clear the hospitals, but in either case, get that damage to as high a value as you can, and meet those other two constraints at the start.